the language of this event will be mainly English, but I will say a few words in Finnish at the beginning to respect some traditions of Turku School of Economics. Arvoisa yleisö, tervetuloa kuuntelemaan, kun tohtori Tuomas Kuhmonen puolustaa toista väitöskirjaansa. Tuolla näkyy myös ensimmäinen väitöskirja, se mikä tänään tarkastetaan, on tämän näköinen. Ja meillä on suuri kunnia saada systeemianalyysin professori Ahti Salo tänne opponentiksi. Mun nimi on Petri Tapio, toimin tilaisuuden kustoksena. Ja kirjasta voi sanoa sen verran, että se käsittelee systeemianalyysiä ja kompleksisuusajattelua ja erityisesti sitä, miten ne liittyvät tulevaisuuden tutkimukseen. Kirjan otsikko on Design Principles for Alternative Futures or Complex Adaptive Systems. Ja, no niin, Turun kauppakorkeakoulun tohtoriohjelman johtajan määräämänä kustoksena julistan väitöstilaisuuden alkaneeksi.
Learned custos, my esteemed opponent, honorable members of the audience. First, some premises of my work. Societies are complex adaptive systems. They have no central command or ownership. Nobody owns the Finnish food system or the municipality of Vesanto. Nobody can dictate their future. They are comprised of heterogeneous actors which have different values, preferences, resources, and behavioral tendencies. They are capable for self-organization to take different forms. And they have subsystems like we have the global, European, Finnish, and local food systems. And they take various locations in the state space. Futures of these systems are crucial because they produce many of the important things that we need: our food, our energy, transportation, and regional development, for example. All these systems involve human action, and because we humans always have some latitude to do things otherwise, at least to a certain extent, the futures are open. And when we combine these characteristics of the systems and the setting of open futures, the number of possible futures is huge. These systems can really take many kinds of alternative forms. Academic futures research is exercised, in my opinion, to become aware of different future alternatives to serve choices in the present. And then we have the problem. If we have basically, say, 5,000 alternatives for the global food system, how can we end up with, say, a handful, like 5 manifestations of the alternative futures, like vision scenarios or futures images, to serve the choices in the present? 5,000 is too much. Then we have 3 critical questions which I have discussed in my dissertation. How to choose an appropriate level of abstraction, how to delimit the choice space, and how to identify future attractors for the systems. And the context of my study is agri-food systems and rural futures. Some words about the analytical framework. Quite many approaches can contribute to finding ways to delimit the number of possible futures. Like, for example, complexity thinking, we have kind of 2 different states of the system. Either they are in a rather stable period of development, or then they face bifurcations or crucial epochs, depending on the concept you want to use. And different approaches have different concepts and explanations for these states of the system. Like complexity thinking proposes that when the systems are in the stable stage, they are located in the basins of attraction. They are in the bowls which are formed by certain attractors, like you can think of fossil economy, which sets the limits for the system. Evolutionary approach use different concepts like the fitness landscape. If the actors and the actions have a good fit with the selection environment, they are on the mountain top. They have a good fitness with the selection environment. And this location is very useful because it's normally implying that you get more resources from the environment, better profit, more resources. So basically both approaches explain that when you have a stable state, you are located in the basin of attraction or at the mountain top. You can think both as a map. And both locations are beneficial for the actors. Then, of course, sometimes things change. In the complexity language, we think that the system swap attractors, and in the evolutionary language, the change in the fitness landscape will change the location of the actors. But both approaches end up in the same kind of explanation of the system. So when the actors are in the basin of attraction or at the mountain top, they are in clusters. They are organized in the same kind of format. They have similar behavioral tendencies, and they kind of set up a regime, which is a dominant design of the system. And it's quite persistent. It resists significant changes, and it only normally quite often changes through a major crisis. The interest in the futures research is not in the stable periods. We can left that for the economists, but in the bifurcation points. If such is coming, can we anticipate such? And what are the options for the system after the bifurcation? That's our research interest. And I have elaborated some design principles, how you can deal with these challenges, how you can choose an appropriate level of abstraction, how you can delimit the choice space, how you can identify the new attractors for the system after the bifurcation. And that's only a kind of a checklist based on literature and these conceptual underpinnings about topics that could be useful in trying to figure out these aspects. I have applied or illustrated application of the design principles in 6 original research articles you can see here. And I wanted to test them with different topics. So the articles feature spatial futures, personal futures, system futures, policy futures, system evolution over time, and sector futures. Some insights from the empirical articles. This is a study of the evolution of the Finnish agri-food system over a few hundreds of years back in time. And what was evident was that, well, the complex adaptive systems tend to organize regimes, as we were expecting based on the conceptual elaboration. In this case, we were able to identify 6 different regimes, which changed to a new one through a major crisis. And okay, we can also say that the regime shift is possible, it happens, it can be identified. Further on, the regime shift, even though it takes place every now and then in the complex adaptive systems, many of the institutionalized regimes, when they are located in the basins of attraction or at the mountain tops where the actors and certain kinds of activities have been clustered, they are strongly path dependent and resist fundamental changes. Like a brilliant example is the Common Agricultural Policy of the European Union. Originally, it was established in the famous year 1962 as a quite simple market policy. It had very few objectives. But now, as you can see, it tries to address all the possible societal problems you can imagine. And it's the jam. It's quite impossible to take any single problem out of the system and say that it's resolved. So it would ask a system-level reform. And you can imagine a system-level reform is really tricky to make. It would be called a revolution. Still becoming aware of the current regimes is important, but it's also important to remember that also the becoming regimes will be configured by attractors. So what are the future attractors for the systems that we are interested in is extremely important. And in the empirical studies that are included in my dissertation, I have a long list of possible attractors that could configure these systems after the bifurcation in the future. So it's important to remember that even though Helsingin Sanomat and YLA News proposes only one future for the rural areas and agriculture, there are more. As the businesswoman of the year in Ireland once said, if you can see it, you can be it. So our work as academic futures scientists is to make these alternative futures visible. That's our responsibility. As a conclusion, I think it is quite important to keep in touch with the philosophical and epistemological foundations of futures research. Futures research is sometimes considered as a methodology toolbox because we have so many methods to tease out alternative futures. But we also have a deeper basis. It's important to remember that the metaphysics of different worldviews, synthetical a priori propositions, and intuition are important in our work, like Immanuel Kant wrote a really long time ago. Also, the conjectural and provisional nature of the knowledge about futures is important to remember, like de Jouvenel once said. And maybe most of all, the benefit of becoming aware is more important than predict, because we can't know the future. It does not exist. But if we become aware of the future possibilities, then we have the chance to choose otherwise in the present than in the past. Also, looking forward is important. Future research does not produce correct results, but it might create useful questions, cues, and insights that expand our sphere of knowledge of future possibilities. That's, in my opinion, the main task of the future research. But because we still have, even though we apply brilliant design principles for alternative futures, we still have so many of them. We still need a lot of futures research, and it should be done with diversified forms to observe the diversity. I respectfully ask you, esteemed Professor Ahti Salo, as the opponent appointed by the Turku School of Economics for the public defense of my doctoral dissertation, to present your criticism of my doctoral dissertation.
So thank you very much for the invitation to come to Turku to act as the official opponent in the examination of Tuomas Kuhmonen's dissertation, Design Principles for Alternative Futures of Complex Adaptive Systems. And I could perhaps start by seeking to dissect the very title of your dissertation. So what are some of the key words? We find it's like futures, and it's in plural. It means that there are many futures. We're not predicting. There is no such thing as a single future, which would be dooming upon us. It really admits that we really don't know for sure what the future, as it will be realized as a one sole trajectory, will hold in store for us. Yet it may be useful, helpful, and even responsible to seek to chart some of the alternative ways. And that's another word in the title of your dissertation, alternative futures. And I would say that the recent crises of this decade, the pandemic and presently the ongoing war, have amply demonstrated that this is indeed the case. Another key word in the title, the very first word, is design. So it doesn't suggest that we would be at the mercy of the future, so to speak, so we can take a proactive stance relative to the future which is unfolding. We can shape it. And what's also very telling, that you don't use the term solution, so to speak. So we're not providing a solution, so to speak. Rather, the term which you're using is principle. And the principle by which we as a community of citizens, stakeholders, policymakers, influencers, whatever it may be, may perhaps seek to embrace in order to shape the future trajectory in a way which would be like contributing to the values which we seek to achieve in society. And the third component, which is quite pervasive, perhaps constitutes, and why I may have been appointed to this role, is complex adaptive systems. There are many words here, but one of the key terms, the first one is complex, and we shall be discussing what we mean by complexity in a sense. But nevertheless, it seems that it's not, in intuitive terms, the opposite of complex is simple. And if it's a simple system, I mean, even perhaps we don't need science. And this is not a scientific statement, but if things are really simple, perhaps we don't need cutting-edge science. We are dealing with complex systems. And we are also dealing with adaptive systems. They are adapting to the policies, decisions we are about to take. So it's not like planets orbiting the sun. We seek to influence them. And the notion of a system, it consists of many parts, and by definition, a system is something which can be understood by a policy of divide and conquer. We seek to identify what are the constituent parts of a system, what are the interrelationships between those parts presently in the future, and how can we seek to deploy our understanding of those interrelationships and the components in order to better understand what are some of the trajectories which may be more likely than others if we're using probabilistic terms. And a prime example in your dissertation is that of agriculture. So pervasively, that's the domain. And it's one in which we have many stakeholders, which is critical for society, also from the viewpoint of emergency supplies. We all need to eat every day. And it's also subject to external shocks, climate change, even political tensions, geopolitical issues may have to be accounted for. It's very path dependent. We are not building from scratch. It's not a gadget which is to be innovated here and now. we have a legacy of centuries, which is highlighted in one of your papers. And it's historically rooted also in terms of values, which we need to recognize and perhaps also to subscribe to. So in the dissertation, Tuomas Kuhmonen has presented, he's addressing all these components, putting them together into a compilation of 6 articles, which are mutually enriching in the sense that they are a coherent body of knowledge. And they also provide a wealth of experience from a range of case studies where the design principles have been leveraged to generate actionable recommendations to some extent, and insights into the usability, usefulness, and value of some of the design principles. And with this, I would then start my inquiry and make some questions as to more general questions perhaps first, and then later on proceeding into the individual papers. And knowing that you are in possession of one of these hats, when did you start thinking about writing a dissertation on this topic? I mean, in terms of just how many years ago, so to speak?
I'm a bit embarrassed to say that a long time ago. I came to Finland Futures Research Center more than 10 years ago, actually 14 years ago. And I had done some future research before that, but when I came here, I thought that, well, this is still a new field for me, and it would be useful somehow to learn the basics, for example, the huge number of methods that we use. And I thought that for a lazy person like me, making a dissertation would be a nice way to kind of get an idea what's the research field. And so I started quite soon after I came, more than 10 years ago, to plan for the dissertation. But then many things came in between. And then only now I was able to finish it. So that was kind of a way to learn future research for me.
Yeah, and if I may rephrase in the question, was it like top-down in the sense that you have the overarching objective of pursuing a dissertation, which would then result in papers, or the other way around?
The other way around, the normal way. I had many plans in the beginning, but none of the plans are on the table by now. Yeah. So it was only afterwards that I invented why it was a kind of a retrospect when I started to think about the problems in the work that I have been doing at the Finland Futures Research Center, many projects. What have been the most challenging things, like finding the kind of small spaces in all the possibilities and choosing the level of abstraction. And then one of my colleagues in one of the postgraduate seminars said the magical words when she tried to say, "What are you explaining to me?" She used the words design principles. And now when I again took the project on my table a couple of years ago to make sense of the articles, I used these design principles from her words. And then it started to open as a kind of cohesive package of research articles.
And then especially in the introductory summary chapter, you devote quite a bit of attention to what you mean by design principle. And I was wondering, how would you relate that to something which might be called a guideline, a recipe, a methodology, prescription? So how do you position it on the axis of, let's say, providing strict normative guidelines as to how one should proceed? So how do you see it in terms of?
Yes, there are many concepts that are close to it, even plans. But maybe when you read the literature on design, which is used quite a lot, for example, in strategic management, the design normally takes a certain stance out of many alternatives. So that's the design. And that's different from the plan. You normally plan only one thing. And we have the alternative futures. There are always many options. And when I thought that when you make a design, you have something plastic in your hands. It depends on the research question you have, on the context, on the topic, what's the best way to deal with these three challenges: abstraction, delimitation, and identification of new attractors. And I thought that design principles are at best like a checklist of topics that could be useful in planning, designing, creating new or future alternatives. So I would say it's closer to checklist than a methodology. It could be also methodology, but that's a bit too high ranking for me.
And one of the benefits of methodology is that it's translatable in the sense that someone else may be using it. Yeah. And your understanding of a design principle as you have adopted. So my question would be that how easy do you think it would be for someone else to build on some of the approaches you have demonstrated in the case of case studies to some other context? And even beyond, let's say, the social and healthcare reform in Finland, I would argue it's a complex, I could even use a naughtier word than an adaptive system, but nevertheless, so how do you see the potential of benefiting from this methodology or design principles in other contexts?
Yes, in academic future research, we are used to the fact that we can't ex ante define the usefulness of our work. So maybe after 2 years, I will be sitting on a terrace with a beer and look if anybody has adopted this approach. But there was also this idea when I didn't use a subtitle, because quite often you have a subtitle in your dissertation. I could have used agri-food systems and so on. But when I think about the design principles and these complex or very complex adaptive systems, I think they could be useful because they are generic aspects in the checklists that I have used.
Good. Then perhaps we could have a discussion of some of the related, because when we are talking about not knowing the future, so the future is inherently uncertain. You also refer to Knightian uncertainty. And there are like these, in consultant speak, like VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. So how would you see these kinds of terms? And I have another acronym in a bit, but if we take the VUCA, volatile, uncertain, so what's the relationship between your work and volatility?
Well, all these concepts are relatives. They are quite close relatives because we have the dynamics, we have the uncertainty in the future, but because it's epistemologically inaccessible. So not disregarding the term we are using for that kind of future, they all mean the same in this sense. And Knight, when he made his famous book in 1921, which is quite much used in entrepreneurship science, he was discussing the entrepreneurs, which also take this kind of position to the future. They commit to a certain line of action, the end point of which they don't know at that time. And they try to make estimates of the probabilities. They first can make an estimate of the outcome of their enterprise, and then they can make an estimate of their own kind of guess of that probability. So that's kind of the Knightian uncertainty. And all these VUCA concepts, they discuss the same things, maybe including more or less ingredients. VUCA is more a construct than a concept because it includes many dimensions. So they are close relatives.
And then we also have the acronym BANI, B-A-N-I, meaning brittle, anxious, nonlinear, incomprehensible. So that's been, in simple speak, there have been arguments that the world used to be VUCA, it's no longer, we are now in BANI. And what's your reflection if something is really incomprehensible? So what can we do, if anything?
Yes, we can do. All the complex systems can be said that in their details, they are incomprehensible. But then we have this level of abstraction. And the level of abstraction in the branch of philosophy, which is called levelism, it has a central idea that the level of abstraction should be chosen in such a way that it's in principle possible to get answers to your research questions. And that's the way to make sense of the incomprehensible. You choose the appropriate level of abstraction at which the work you do will serve your research questions, and you can kind of make sense of the complexity of the system, because at the detail level, nobody can make sense of the Finnish food system. But a little bit high, well, some are suspected, but at the higher level of abstraction, it's mighty possible.
Yeah. And you're using the term, the appropriate flight altitude.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is that, would you advise to go for a single flight altitude, or would it be good to go really high up at times and really delve deep, close to the surface every so often? So what's the proper mixture? Or is it sufficient to have this appropriate flight altitude of analysis all along? Or what would you miss, if anything, by doing so?
Yes, I'm not proposing to use 5 kilometers as a starting point. I always think that, at least in the academic future research, we make a lot of topic-driven research. We always have a societal problem we try to resolve in one way or the other. And then the research question becomes the subordinate. It tells us to which kind of things we should be able to answer. And that defines the kind of level of abstraction. We might think that we can adopt different strategies, like the diffusion strategy, if we want to know more about things that we already know quite well at a more detailed level. Or then an abstraction strategy, that we can see the huge diversity of details, but we want to make sense what it might be when we take a bit higher flight altitude. This was a topic I was elaborating in my first dissertation quite long.
Oh, okay. Yes. And how do you see the possibilities of relying on, let's say, semi-automated AI tools for helping you to reach the flight altitude in summarizing information?
Well, I think all the means are legal in future research because we don't know the future. They can, of course, assist in finding things, mapping things, but because we still have to use intuition, for example, and it's quite difficult to be mechanical in, for example, if I want to create futures images for alternative food systems. I think AI can find many ingredients, propose something, but still to have the logic, for example. You know that, but you have to read the 10,000 pages of the work that has been done before to be on the track.
So a good slave, but not a master.
Yes.
So then, one thought, listening to your initial presentation, so I was like the notion of having stable periods and bifurcation periods, and would we really know in which period we are? So, so do you see any uncertainty as to being able to interpret?
There are signs of the future, like if we use the adaptive renewable cycle as our methodology as we used, you can observe that the regimes have a life cycle. For example, if you think about the current agri-food regime, which started upon the EU accession in 1995, the first years of the membership, there was a lot of diversity in the food system. Small food processors, organic farming became much more common. It was much more liberal. The position of the trade was not this dominant. And it was the early stage, the growth stage, and gradually when the regime matured, things became more consolidated, more institutionalized. The subsidy system has more and more demands and regulations. The dominant actors have a more powerful role, and it's more and more difficult to act otherwise. So you can try to identify the life cycle of the regime, and if it follows the pattern that it has been following the last 700 years, the conservation period which we are actually living by now is followed by a regime shift, because the regime becomes fragile, it becomes unable to react to the diversity demands, and then something past it has been a crisis, and then a new regime takes over. So you can a bit anticipate like this.
Yes. So that's covered in paper number 4, I think it was. Oh, 5.
5.
5, yes. So another thought which I had in the like the stable versus bifurcation. So it sort of pitches these two against each other, and life, it's not only black and white, it's shades of gray, so to speak.
Yes.
So so do you see that it serves as a conceptual tool, but is it too simple? I mean, would it, because if I think of like risk analysis, sometimes we have multi, I mean, it's not a failed component or not an operational, it may be partly working. So are you aware of work which would seek to like be less simplistic in terms of like assigning periods to either bifurcation versus stability? What do you think? Would it be helpful? I mean, if you wanted to add a new label, semi-stable bifurcation, I don't know what you would call it. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the topic here.
Yeah, you need simple tools for complex things.
Yeah.
And I think the model originally proposed by Mika Mannermaa and Erwin Laszlo, who both share an evolutionary perspective on societal change and evolution, I think it's a very useful concept, because if we look at the past and, for example, the food system, the crises have been quite short and quite deep, and the new direction has started immediately. Of course, it has not been a dominant design after 5 years, but the new direction has started quite immediately after the crisis. So it's quite sharp in that sense. And also, of course, we can think that maybe in some complex societal systems, it's possible to have two parallel systems. And then it's not that clear. But actually in the food system, this has not been the case in the past. And it's, of course, we have a highly regulated sector. And if we had, for example, the agro-industrial regime and the agro-ecological regime living next to each other at the same time, we would need two policy systems. We would need two of everything, two logistical systems. And that complexity is always expensive to govern. So the governance costs would be used. And that's also the reason why in the past, at least, the system changes and the regime changes have been quite sharp. And of course, you can see some of the old things continuing also in the new regime, and you can see the forerunners already living in the previous regime, which might then take over after the regime shift. So you are correct that it's gray, but analytically it's quite simple to present in it that way.
And another dichotomy, so to speak, is like, what is the realm of the economists and what is the realm of the futures researchers, so to speak? And how do you see the overlap between the two? Can we rely on modeling activity as it is being conducted in econometrics, for instance? So,
yes, my first education was an agricultural economist, and I think now that I can say also something negative about economics because of that reason.
Please do.
Economics is the physics of society. So it's really based on the dominant format of neoclassical economics is based on high level of rationality in the choices. We make a global calculation of all the alternatives, which gives us the highest utility within the resource limitation that we have. And then based on many of these kinds of premises, it's possible to make models and make forecasts. And economists make forecasts. Futurists don't make forecasts. We plan for alternative futures. Because with the models, which always based on the past preferences, the past laws of behavioral tendencies, the past resource accumulations and many other things, and when we still have these bifurcations, they work if we have the stable period. But when the preferences will change, when we have the Lehman Brothers case, then they can't say nothing. And that's one of the main differences between future research. Modeling is also used in future research, like soft forms of modeling, but maybe we have a more flexible and more diversified thinking about how the systems work.
And would you dare to argue that the models as they're being proposed by economists are not really valid in the sense of being suited to this period of historical moment?
The models of the economists are models of the economy, and we are discussing much broader topics than economy in future research. When the things run smoothly, they can say something about the economy, that they are useful in that sense, yes.
But complementary.
Complementary, yes.
Yeah, so that's a useful clarification. Thank you. And proceeding, if I continue some of the thoughts on complexity, and also like you're talking, the research is for researchers primarily. I mean, the articles, scientific papers you've written, they will mostly be read by other scientists. But then again, there are beneficiaries of your research, stakeholders in society, policymakers, and so. And if I think of the notion of complex system as it is being addressed in physics, for instance, so we have a complex system, but the notion of having multiple stakeholders, how important an ingredient is it to the structure of your systems? So it's inseparable, or how would you see? I mean, if we just would have a, let's say, a monopoly of sorts, would it make your agriculture food system so much easier? What do you think? I'm just a penny for your thoughts.
It would make them easier, but worse. That's the problem. Because we have the open futures, we always have the many alternatives we can choose. As you said, we can have an impact on the future. And we have many objectives that we would need to reach in the future and change things from the present. And for that, there are many ways. There are options. You can use many criteria. You can use all the 4 dimensions of sustainability to assess and evaluate the designs of the future that you have made. And I think the complexity and the complex systems idea is important also for the stakeholders. Like you can think that in the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, there are people who have been sitting there for ages doing the same thing. And for them thinking something different, that we have these 4 alternatives and not only the one, this is a very useful tool to show that it's indeed the case.
So there are some general questions I'll be returning to, but perhaps we can take a look at some of the individual papers in your dissertation. And in paper 1, you are, or perhaps like, before we delve into the first paper 1, in section 2.1 of your introductory chapter, the multiverse of complex adaptive systems as a target of foresight, you have this table, figure 8, and you are referring to the cycles, business cycles, quantitative waves, adaptive cycles. And they both are characterized by shifts, but they are recurrent shifts. And I was wondering, I mean, in a sense, the historical timeline is on the horizontal axis, and it sort of suggests, I don't know if you mean it, but this is my question, I mean, would you be arguing that business cycles are of equal duration than contractive cycles, or so are they? What's the calendar time, so to speak? So how would these cycles relate to each other?
Yes, we are now on page 38. So, it's a matter of the presentation. Of course, they have different time frames. Like, for example, the quantitative cycles, they are decades. But the point is that this is kind of historical time. It's not calendar time, so it's about maturation. So the stages of the cycles follow each other in a certain order. When, for example, the regime becomes older, or the business cycle becomes older and more mature, or the quantitative cycle becomes more mature. And so it was quite exciting to be able to identify different types of stages in many of these presentations, how the cycles unfold, the kind of cyclical pattern of evolution.
So there are many analogues.
Yes. That was the point.
Yeah. And then if I take figure number 9, and in using the notion of basin of attraction as a characterization of a system which is more or less stable, and but if I think of the flight altitude, so to speak, as an analog, so and also I think it is in figure. You have the very telling diagram. Figure 10. So you're explicitly referred. So the basin of attraction would be at a lower point. Mm-hmm. And I used to do some hand gliding, and the one thing which was really good to have is like altitude, because it means that you have energy. So do you see that there's any? You're identifying the basins of attraction. That's very good. But would you like make any statements as to the relative altitudes of the different basins of attraction? Mm-hmm. So does it make any sense to? Now it's a conceptual metaphor. I mean, there's a basin of attraction. Here's another one. Okay, but would you be willing to argue that there's a basin of attraction which is better in the sense that it offers more energy? Because I was yesterday talking about resilience, and there was Denmark and Finland. I mean, which country is the more resilient? Mm-hmm. And arguably Denmark is more resilient because they are not as financially constrained as the Finnish government is presently. So my question is here. So would you think that some of the basins of attractions would be better in the sense of that they would be on a higher level in reference to figure 10? Mm-hmm. Or so that's What's your thinking?
Yes, for most of the complex societal adaptive systems, if you look at the state space, like we use the concept in the complexity thinking, there are many basins of attraction of different sizes. Like for example, we can say that for the Western society, we have a huge basin of attraction in which the fossil economy, the fossil fuels are the attractors. But in the landscape, in the state space, there are also many other ones. And not all the eggs are in the same bowl. And then the flight altitude is important, because if you fly too low, you can't even see maybe that we have this kind of fossil economy which is everywhere, which define everything more or less in our economy, or many things also in our society and regional development. So then if you take a higher level of abstraction, you might start to see over the corners of the bowl where we are living with this fossil economy, and maybe see that there are other basins. And also too high flight altitude means that because for most of the societal systems, the landscape in the evolutionary vocabulary is rugged. So there are many mountaintops and valleys. And if you fly too high, you can't see the smaller basins, like, for example, for the food system, the basin of agroecology. Yeah. So it's critical in that sense. Yeah. Yeah. But also, like somebody wrote, that we quite often, and also in future research, and also me, made the level of abstraction and many kinds of these choices not explicitly. And that's one of the proposals I made, that we should think the level of abstraction against our research questions, what we want to see, and it has huge implications for that.
Yeah. Yeah. Then if I then take figure 11, also in the we have the multi-level perspective, adaptive cycle X-curve. And the one question I had, and I trust you have taken the X-curve from a Hebbing, I think. Mm-hmm. And because I've been teaching optimization, and if I look at this X-curve here, I mean, it's just like 2 steps away from chaos. and breakdown. So I mean, would you subscribe to this idea, and what might be the meaning of chaos, which is to be achieved through optimization?
Yes, not all the best concepts are used in every analytical framework. I agree. Yeah. It's not made by me.
Yeah, but I understand it's coming. But I would say that of the large language models, they're based on so fitting like 8 billion parameters, and then we have answers by ChatGPT. So perhaps I then move on to paper, unless let's see now if I... Yes, so moving to paper 1, and you have the feedback loops in the I mean, you have the figure 1 for futures images of the 4 rural areas. And in a sense, it starts from the markets. It's proceeding from the use of natural, but it's in a sense linear from the initial setup. And I was wondering, how do you see the notion of feedback loops in the context of this setup?
Yes, this exercise was quite traditional futures research exercise in which we wanted to create futures images, so certain descriptions of the state of affairs in a certain point of time. And we quite often make them quite different from each others. And this kind of skeleton is just logic to end up with four different futures images, because we want to make them different. They will be mixed in the practice, of course, but making them quite different serves the choice in the present. Whether we want to end up with the museum countryside, if we choose this kind of path, we could end up here. Is it a state of affairs that we want to go? So making again visible the end point of our choice. This has not so much of the systems thinking behind it. So,
yeah. And if you were to summarize, what was, in your own view, the main contribution of this paper, scientifically and also like for the policymakers or other stakeholders?
Yes, this was quite a nice exercise. We had many stakeholders involved in the design process, and it was done. I think the empirical work was done like 13 years ago, and then now when we look at the developments, and we came up with four alternative futures image lists: decentralized bioeconomy, colonial countryside, museum countryside, and rural business islands. All of these have happened in a certain context, in a certain region, in a certain kind of size. So it was quite useful, and I think this is still one of the most useful works for the stakeholders when we make regional development plans, when we plan for the policies for the use of natural resources or nature conservation or many other things. So I'm quite happy with it.
Yeah. And if you think of the impact, would you say that was it like incremental or revolutionary? I mean, if I take some of these axes on which you could characterize a project, so was it path-breaking, or were they surprising, so to speak, in terms of their content?
I should be a little bit humble here, but I think the kind of design of the futures was quite successful. These were quite nicely descriptive, and I have seen these many times before, so they have been used in the policy discussions and documents, at least some times ago. So,
yeah. And did you have any difficulties? Because sometimes when you create a project, it's not to be taken for granted that everyone is on board. Mm-hmm. If it has the potential of really influencing policy decisions, so there may be some stakeholders who would be really opposing the aims of your project. So was this the case here or in any of the other case studies? So the challenge of keeping everyone on board so as not to cannibalize it in the media, shooting you down the day after.
yes.
So
I think we, after working 30 years with the Finnish policymakers in agricultural, food and rural policies, I think we still have a bit the habit of one alternative thinking. And so all the work that shows that we have many alternatives, to make them visible, illustrate them, and encourage to think of the alternatives and not just to choose the dominant one, to continue with the dominant one. There's still a lot of work to be done, believe me. So that,
there's inertia.
Yes.
Inertia, too
Yes.
much inertia.
Good, yes.
Then related, looking at the images of the future, to some extent, it's like rural futures. And this is building partly not so much on my research, but having spent 1/3 of my life on a farm. But nevertheless, so farming is not about agriculture. It's also about doing like some forestry, and also like oftentimes providing perhaps like plowing the small roads for your neighbor and whatever. So to what extent do you see that if you set the boundaries of your inquiry on the rural futures based on farming, is it a limitation, or and how do you see these like neighboring services that may be provided, let's say, for tourism, or so what's your thought?
Yes, of course we have different perspectives, like the rural areas are the top concept, which includes agriculture, all the basic services, and where you put the limit of agriculture, of course you can think of just food production activities. But as you said, many farms do also forestry work, like I do also, and that's part of the farm, but that's not necessarily part of the agriculture. But well, we use same machinery, so it's not kind of a critical question in that sense.
Yeah, yeah. And would you say that then, would you rather, I mean, if you were to have a really everything which happens in the countryside, so would you rather have a study which is focused on agriculture and then have exposed later adjustments? Or would you start from a more comprehensive study which seeks to bring everyone on board? And so which approach would you?
Yes, for us at the Finland Futures Research Center, it's simple. We see for what research we can get money.
Yeah, okay.
Then,
so the ministry was...
then comes the research question. And then we try to solve it. And that defines whether it's rural or it's agriculture or it's food or anything.
Yeah.
So
it's good. It's good. I really enjoyed it.
It's simple for us.
Yeah. But shall we take paper number 2? The how do rural areas profile in the future's dreams by the Finnish youth? You had a good sized, and again, would you perhaps wish to summarize your own perception of the key merits of this paper? And
yes, if you read Helsingin Sanomat or Yle News, you quite often see the message that there's no future for rural areas, and all the young people move to the cities. Mm-hmm. But when you make a scientific inquiry based on large random samples that we have done 4 times by now, and ask, well, what's your dream? What's your livelihood dream, accommodation dream, lifestyle dream? What are the obstacles for realizing your dreams? You surprisingly get more or less the same answers. We started 2013, 17, 20, and this year. And the result is more or less always the same. Young people dream about all kinds, all types of areas. Urban areas, urban adjacent rural areas, rural villages, and remote rural areas. And depending on the target of the dream, the content of the dream is different. So of course there's more urban ingredients in the urban dreams, and also surprisingly, for example, the young people who dream to live quite close to cities but outside the cities don't want neighbors nearby. That's a nightmare for the environmental authorities because dispersed settlement is a catastrophe for them. So it's really surprising that in all the surveys, when we looked at the numbers, if this age group moved into the destination of the dreams regarding the type of the region, the number of this generation in the cities would be cut maybe by a half. The number of them in the rural areas close to city would be 4 or 5 times it is by now. The number of them in the rural villages would decline a little bit, and their numbers in remote rural areas would double. And it has been exactly the same in all the 4 large surveys that we have made. So the young people dream about rural areas, but they, for example, they are forced to move to the cities to get a job. Mm-hmm. And then when they want to come back to rural areas, they don't have the money because they have been living in the cities, and we don't have houses for rent in the rural areas. hardly at all. So it's difficult to move there back. So I think that there were many quite not obvious results if you only read the mass media news.
And then I would have one question, which is not so much focused on your paper as such, but I was wondering, because we're nowadays talking about mental health issues, and the one question is that if people who grown up in the countryside or dream of living in the countryside, are they happier in a sense? I mean, as a country, we're reasonably happy, but how is there any anecdotal evidence from your surveys that you would say that people who have agricultural dreams would be happier, or would you venture to say anything, or is it?
We don't make medical research, but you can see, for example, that they have a vital dream to come there, and if you look at the ingredients of the dreams, what are the young people who dream about, for example, remote rural areas? They dream about peaceful life. They dream about making work with their hands, working with the animals, working in the garden. And of course, those all are things which are related to the mental health. So they probably see that the life could be better over there if I will get there.
And is there any follow-up research on to what extent may have their dreams have materialized?
No directly, but of course we can see the statistics. And well, we have many of the obstacles, like the young people report themselves, the lack of money, the lack of courage, the lack of place. So there are many reasons why the dreams won't realize. But for example, for the local decision makers, we have a list of things that the young people are dreaming of. So just realize the list to get them.
Good. Perhaps we move to paper number 3. And that's a sole authored paper published in one of the best journals in the field, exposing the attractors of evolving complex adaptive systems by utilizing futures images, milestones of the food sustainability journey. And it's very rich in terms of methodologies. So would you perhaps summarize what you think its most significant contributions?
Yes, this was right to the topic. So we wanted I wanted to know what would be the future attractors and the saddle points. And of course, we can see the dominant kind of role the trade plays here. Many of the topics were related to logistics and markets. And surprisingly, the attractors and the saddle points, so the mountains that should be climbed over upon regime shifts, they were both related to the same topics. And that was quite, well, it told that the landscape or the state space is quite institutionalized. And I think that this quite well showed the rigidity of the systems. So we can say that we can identify the attractors, but at the same time we can see that the state space is rather rigid, and it's really difficult to change, to climb over the mountain. And if you think about the other option, crumble or the basin of attraction, it's not here. So I think that was it's kind of confirmation of the state of affairs you can also read in the papers.
Yeah. And in the workshops you organized, in terms of facilitating those workshops, did you use like flip charts or any computer-assisted tools, or how did it work technically?
I rely on manual work.
Manual work.
Yeah. So just piece of paper and a pen. That's, I think, the method I mostly use in futures workshops, because we can use computers to assist or collect the results immediately, but because you should be creative, and then you should have all the attention in your thinking and not in working with the laptops or some other disturbing vehicles. So that I think in all the workshops I normally use just pen and paper.
And would you say that the spirit of the workshops was collegial or consensual, or was it tense at any moment?
It was. It's even after organizing dozens of futures workshops in different topics. It's always amazing to see that if you manage to set a right question for the people, an interesting task, disregarding their background and position, they start to discuss immediately. It's kind of a magic, but it depends that you will have to find them a question that they all are interested, so they can all contribute. And that ask, of course, you need to have the background information and know something about the research methods that we use in future research.
It resonates with my experience, as if there was a pent-up demand for being able to talk about the future, because we're now overburdened. But that's another, we can talk later. But nevertheless, so maybe explain any regional differences, because you had like different workshops in different.
Yes, of course, the food systems and the food culture in Ostrobothnia is different from Eastern Finland. But then when you choose the level of abstraction correctly, if you succeed in that, you will find the same things maybe expressed in different ways. But you can all, like here we have only the one format of each topic, and it was not necessary to do many of them, so the regional versions. Of course, we also have in the original research report, we have also the results of the regional workshops, but they were not that different.
And the people from the different regions would be behaving more or less similar? No, like Savo people wouldn't be different from.
People in Ostrobothnia tend to be a bit different from the Eastern Finland people, but they are still nice. So it's not it's not a problem.
Yeah. So, and on page 222 of the paper proper, we still have the problem of external validity of our futures images, and. So if one were to address this notion of external validity, how should one approach it? I mean, do you see it as is it just an observation and that's it? Or is it something one should worry about?
We just want to forget it in future research. Because I think also with these futures images and the attractors, the main point also with this paper to broaden our understanding of the future possibilities, that we have these kinds of saddle points and we have these kinds of attractors. And when you plan your own work as a farmer or an entrepreneur or policymaker, you can use this to think about your own work and your own future. And that's the only kind of validity aspect in this work.
Then moving to paper number 4, published in Land Use Policy, sole authored paper on the Common Agricultural Policy. And so I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and you're using system dynamics and diagrams such as the diagram number 3, causal loop systems, to illustrate some of the interrelationships. And perhaps, would you wish to summarize how you arrived at this representation? And I mean, how many iterations did it take you to arrive at this one? How many early versions did you have before you arrived at this one or the previous ones?
It was based on a Delphi study from, I remember, 52 Finnish experts, if I remember correctly. And I asked them the problems to be addressed by the Common Agricultural Policy and make short kind of causal links, why it is and what would be the consequence. And then I used the greatest invention of the mankind, Excel, and just make all the pairs into Excel, and then there, of course, some overlapping, so double, I just removed them to have one, and then I made the figure with Adobe Illustrator.
And then we have the notion of a causal link. And causality, it has like several attributes to it. I mean, it's the extent, I mean, is it a strong impact or a weak impact? And what is the delay? There's the notion of uncertainty. And this is intuitively inviting and appealing, yes. But if you think of in how many ways things may be influencing each other, there's a wealth of interpretations which could be like added to this. So do you see this as something which could be used for the purposes of simulating or not? Or is it a conceptual framework only, more or less? Because some people are using like causal loops to simulate. And then my question always is that, I mean, are you really sure that you can use it for that purpose? So this is my...
Yes, yeah, that's a good question.
What do you think about this?
If I got more money, I could still have the fourth round of the Delphi, but I didn't. So that could be the round where I could ask about these kind of probabilities or strengths or other topics which would be needed for simulation. Now this is only a conceptual map in a way to show the interrelations. But as such, I think this was enough for the purpose of the research to show the jam that we have and understand the qualities of the complexity that we have in the current public policy of this sector.
Yeah. And based on your experience, if you were to do this again, would you have the same number of elements, or is it too much or too little?
Yeah,
especially figure number 5, because it seems to be more congested than some.
Yes, I think there are 22 or something. It came from the data, so I didn't choose it as such. Of course, I applied a certain level of abstraction to come into a reasonable number. Also now in the formal common agricultural policy, there are quite many formal objectives, not this many. But I think if I now made exactly the same research, none of these problems, societal problems, have been removed from the agenda. Maybe we have some more, like the instability of the markets and maybe the kind of status of the problems would be different. As of course it was also proposed here that it will change in 20 years.
Yeah. And then we have the notion of there are some entities which have many incoming arrows. Another question is that would all of those have to be active in a sense, influencing for the impact to take place, or is a sole driver enough? And actually, like thinking back, what kinds of discussions did you have further to this figure 3? I mean, so did it serve as a communication tool, or what was the utility? I have one more.
Yes, I have shown this quite many times, but of course, when you discuss with the policymakers, they understand that we have this kind of a jam, and we are maybe in a situation that people realize that things should be changed. And like the European Commission always says that it will simplify the cap, it will never happen because we have a system of problems and it asks for system level solutions. So we should change the whole system as such. We would need the revolution. And that kind of future is not really possible without a major external crisis, like huge number of climate refugees, or food shortages, or wars, or something.
Yeah. And then you also identify these punctuated problems. So what I thought was really interesting, so that what are the bits, and if you can't solve the problem at large, at least can you identify? And was this something which came through your work only, or had it been discussed in the literature earlier at all?
It came from the data directly.
But it was your concept?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it was quite interesting observation as such.
Yeah, and it was well received by stakeholders or...
And the reviewers.
Yeah. Oh, okay. No, I mean, including me. Yeah. So that was most inspiring. And moving on to paper number 5, which is the transitions through the dynamics of adaptive cycles, and it's a very historical account, and very balanced, and sets things into the long-term perspective. My one, and you also had it on the opening slides, and it sort of ends with the globalization, and arguably globalization is not like, and at least getting any stronger, it seems. So how would you extrapolate? So what is the, can you?
Yes, yes, it's clear because the first writer was my wife. One of the exciting empirical observations that we made during the research process was that after the regime shift, the attractors of the next regime came from the kind of other side of the coin. So from free trade to protectionism, and again to free trade, from local nutrient-based to external or non-local, and many other these kinds of flips. And now if we think about the globalization regime and the food system, it's based on imported inputs, so interdependency on other countries. It's based on free trade, of course. It's based on specialization, so monocultures. It's based on non-local setting. And so if you ask about the flip side, what could be the ingredients of the next regime following this one? The food system could be more diversified, it could be more self-sufficient, and it could be more local. So if the reasoning and the patterns of the past would be valid in the future, but we don't know. But it's worth of thinking.
Yeah. And do you see any appeal in revisiting some of the earlier regimes? Are there any, not in terms of technology, but in terms of the governance structures, which would hold promise for creating an attractive path trajectory for the Finnish system?
Yes, there are many of course kind of similarities at the high level of abstraction. For example, we already have the kind of globalization number one in the end of the 19th century, when we exported a lot of food to the Russian markets and imported other ones. So there are similarities, and because this was the first trial, we have made also a paper based on the same data from the resilience perspective, and it was quite a nice exercise. And again, you have many perspectives on the same topic, and this is only one of them. And it's tempting idea to take another lens and still look some things like the governance, for example, is an extremely interesting perspective, because it's also related to complexity.
And looking at this paper from the international perspective, so it's focused on Finland, but would you venture to say anything about, has the trajectory been similar in Nordic countries or even globally?
Yes, we have similarities, but of course the story is they have a different. For example, in Sweden, the timing is already different. So each country and the national food systems have different stories. But we had a very strict reviewer from Canada. She wrote, I think, more than 10 pages, but she was also able to understand the kind of the logic of this in Canadian perspective.
So the Finnish system provides insights which are useful for interpreting other countries as well. Yeah. And perhaps I then take paper number 6, which is on multi-level perspectives, published in Sustainable Production and Consumption, Sustainability-Driven Regime Shifts in Complex Adaptive Systems, Animal Production and Food System. And for starters, if you wish to recap some of the key essence of this paper and your perception of its main contribution.
Yes, it started in a coffee table when, again, the role of Finnish livestock production was, it has been quite one-sided, and we wanted to study if there are more perspectives. And we used sustainability as the frame to intentionally differentiate the futures, to have alternative futures. So we took the ethics frame, when all the Finns are vegans, the environmental frame, when animal husbandry serves only the environmental purposes like agrobiodiversity, for example. Then we took the health frame, which means cut in red meat production and consumption. Then we took the self-sufficiency lens, and then we took the global market lens when we, as a superpower of sweet water, can produce a lot of and export a lot of animal products. And these were modeled by Natural Resources Research Institute, and you still can see some smoke in the horizon in Helsinki after that exercise, the desperate exercise. And it was really exciting to see that the framing, which I also discussed as part of the level of abstraction, it can produce a situation where we have zero commercial animal production and a solution where it doubles from the present. So the impact of the framing on the future alternatives, it's really important and significant, and also worth of observing explicitly rather than implicitly going only to one or two most probable or most common or most well-known futures.
And then when you present the regimes, so to what extent were these defined at the outset, how many regimes you wish to portray, or did they emerge during the project, so to speak?
Yes.
So endogenous versus exogenous. I mean, was it stated that we wish to have a fixed number of regimes, or did it emerge naturally from content analysis?
We wanted to have several, but then we thought about the public and the scientific discussions. What are the alternatives that we are discussing? Like food security, we are discussing the health ethics, we are discussing all these aspects, the global market. So it came quite easily from these discourses that we end up with 5.
Right. So it's a uneven number.
Yeah, that's true.
And I really enjoyed many of the diagrams you have, like the MLP map figure 3, And how much time did you spend building these diagrams? Again, what was the process by which you sort of consolidated? And they're very they look the same, I mean, basically, which makes it easier to compare them. I mean, I give that as a credit, but nevertheless, so if you were to characterize, did you have this kind of an approach already at the outset? This is the end result, or is it like something which emerged during the project?
Yes, it emerged late in the evening. We originally made the interviews and made these kind of sketches, like the causal diagrams, and then we turned the results into futures table, so describing the dimensions of the futures in each of these cases, and then it already became quite close to multi-level perspective basic diagram that we use quite a lot in transition research. And then it came from the data, but it was only kind of technical extension to illustrate the change, a regime shift.
Yeah. And was there any data or insights which wouldn't fit naturally into these 5 regimes, or like outliers? So, I mean, we just take, was anything like thrown away? I mean, that's my question. So that it wouldn't naturally fit into these regimes.
No, we already again used the Excel to have all the information, and it all was able to fit all into these. There were no outliers in that sense, so it was quite easy. And what was also what we wanted to show that of course the strength of multi-level perspective map is that we can show that there are different levels. We have the landscape level, we have the regime, and we have the niche level. But it's a kind of one shot, as if we only would have one sustainability transition. And that's of course not the case. You easily think that it's here. But we also were able to add some elements to the landscape level, that if this kind of regime shift happens and we have a new regime, there will be new pressures at the landscape level because the things are different. And then again, there will be a pressure for the next sustainability transition or regime shift.
And one question on the notion of a regime, so to speak, and I mean, it's a dissertation is in English, but what was the Finnish term you would be using in the project? Regime.
I have been thinking that for 10 years with and without Italian red wine, but I have no conclusion, to be honest.
Because I think that the notion of a regime, we have like authoritarian societies which have a regime, so it has somewhat of a negative connotation sometimes. So I was thinking, it sort of sounds as if there's a exercise of power within a given setup, so to speak. So it has,
it's.
I mean, are you happy with the term as it is now, or would you wish to revisit them? And is it like well understood in its proper intended sense, as you now have it in the paper, or would you need to, against the backdrop of my comment?
I think the regime is used quite a lot in sustainability transition research and in the multi-level perspective. It's integral part of that. But it's also used in the foreign policy studies, and then it has a different connotation and a different kind of meaning also, as you said.
So given the right context, then perhaps like elaboration what we mean it by it, that's fine.
Yes.
Good. So I think I will be coming back to my more general questions, and you especially have contributed future sciences, future studies, and contributed to the advancement of science. But the one question is, it's from the viewpoint of policymakers. There's the demand and supply, so to speak. Researchers supply, policymakers may have a demand. And to have a good match, you need to think of both sides. So what would be, should policy making change somehow in order to be more receptive to the kinds of future studies you're producing? And if so, what can we do, or at least as you're all voters in elections and exercise some power? So what's your thought on this? And how is the policy-making machinery, so to speak, if I may use that term, has it become, because you've been working on this for quite some time, so have you noticed any changes, or how do you see the receptiveness in an international context?
No. In the past, the European Commission, when they made policy reforms, they quite often came up with three alternatives. So the first alternative was to continue with the existing. The second alternative was a radical reform, and the third alternative was a compromise. And only the British and the Dutch were in favor, or the Swedes were in favor of the reform, and it was always possible to say that we can continue with the old one. So it always was the compromise what was the next policy reform. So they had three options, but only one in practice. But now, for example, when we are preparing a national food strategy, there is a vision which is not that strong or inspiring, and then we have kind of elements, but it is only for the one option. So it's an extension of the current regime added with exports. So trying to learn to plan alternative futures until they are quite comprehensive. So not to ask opinions and cut all the branches away after a week, but work with them a year or half a year. And then you see what could be the options that we could reach through the food strategy. And that this is a practice that we don't have here. But for example, the Dutch policymakers have been really good in that for decades. So they are forerunners.
Yeah. And what were some of the hardest things in your research? So was it like, if you one priority or two hardest things?
Of course, the empirical work was the hardest thing. But I think the incubation phase was quite long. I kind of did it, but then I didn't do it. But then when I got a permit to start to do this actively from my wife after her dissertation, and the pieces came quite easily, like the title, Design Principles, came from one of my colleagues. Then the three questions also came quite easily, and then it was more or less organized. So it was, I couldn't say it was easy, but the logic, the basic logic and structure was quite ready after those two ingredients.
And if I continue, what might have you done otherwise in hindsight?
If I didn't do this dissertation?
So, yes, now in hindsight, if you were to redo it, what would you do otherwise, knowing this journey?
Maybe I could try to elaborate the empirical findings still more. Now it's one chapter, and it's between the conceptual elaboration and the detailed empirical findings. And I was able to say something about the systemicity of the findings, for example. And that was an interesting part of the work, but it would be possible to go further to discuss more between the conceptual basis and the empirical findings. That would be, I would do more.
Yeah. And the one thought I'd like to ask, or question, is that in many of the papers you're using multiple methodologies, so to speak, and how do you see the value of using multiple methodologies as to using a single methodology? Is it an imperative, or is it useful, or is it for just to show off?
I think in academic futures research that's a tradition, because we have so many uncertainties that triangulation is really much used. Methodological triangulation is special. So that's one of the ways to reduce the uncertainty that we always have at the table already because of the future that we have as a research topic.
And perhaps my final question would be like on complex methodologies. We're dealing with complex adaptive systems, but sometimes methods themselves can become complex. So, so how do you see the complexity of methods? Is it to be avoided, or is it to be embraced? And I may have some perspectives on this, but I would like to hear your thought.
Well, I love simple methods because we have complex issues on the table. So, for example, in most of the articles, I have used content analysis, conventional content analysis without predefined categories. A very simple, though quite difficult method, causal loop diagrams. So, because one of the demands for futures research is that we have to be transparent, because we don't know. So we'll have to show the methods that we have used so that the reader can see what we have actually done. And so that's the reason that I have used quite basic methods in all the articles. Of course, you can run a futures workshop for 2 weeks with 27 stages or phases. But I think, of course, depending on the research question that you have. But for these purposes, quite simple methods and transparent methods have been enough.
Yeah. And I'm very pleased to hear that. because in research, there's sometimes the tendency to overcomplicate things. And good research, it's about helping you see better. And it's like I have to wear these glasses because I don't see otherwise too well. But if your glasses are too thick, obscured by methodology, so to speak. So good methodology helps you see better. It provides you the lens by which you can interpret reality more clearly, as you have done. But if the machinery by which you are seeking to understand reality is so involved that you can't really understand what's going on, it's not very helpful. And I think, with this, I might wish to thank you. These will be concluding my formal questions, and with your permission, I may continue. Shall I?
Please.
So, I'm very pleased to, based on the discussion and the reading of the dissertation and all the preceding stages which have led to this afternoon here today, I'm happy to confirm and endorse the substantial volume of scientific work on the topic of design principles for alternative futures of complex adaptive systems by Tuomas Kuhmonen. And I would say that very briefly, this dissertation is marked by its quality, referring to the number of papers it contains, 6 papers, all published in leading international finest journals, including Technology Forecasting Social Change. It's also marked by breadth, as referring to the adoption of multiple perspectives and variations thereof. Coherence, they all pertain to a well-identified setup of policy questions arising in the Finnish agricultural food systems, and reflexivity as reflected by the ability to assess with authenticity and humility, to really put the substance to the fore and identifying some of the key contributions, such as the notion of the punctuated problems, which is, I really agree with the referees of your, I wasn't one of the referees of the paper, I say that, but that was just one of the highlights. And in total, producing such a body of contributions presumes plenty of maturity, both in terms of mastering a broad range of disciplines, underpinning disciplines, including future studies, and a sound understanding of the realities you've been working on. And against this background, I'm very pleased to recommend to the Turku School of Economics doctoral committee that this dissertation, Design Principles for Alternative Futures of Complex Adaptive Systems, be accepted with distinction. Thank you.
Thank you for your valuable and insightful comments. I now respectfully invite any members of the honored audience who wish to offer criticism of my dissertation to request the custos for permission to speak.
I could see no hands raised, so väitöstilaisuus on päättynyt. I heard that at the University of Helsinki you're not allowed to applaud after the thesis is finished, but now that it's finished, here you can applaud.